Through the whole presentation. If you have any questions, just feel free to raise your hand and stop me.
We'll just interact.
There's not much reason to be too formal in this.
No.
In this
Well,
setting.
this is Mr. Dennis Gronquist, and Mr. Gronquist has been actively involved and concerned about utility issues for quite some time. So this evening we have Raptelis Financial Consultants, whom the SUA has contracted with to do a comprehensive cost of service study and rate analysis. Mr. Tom Beckley is from Kansas City. He's the project manager. And so we have Bill Millis, our utilities director, water utilities director, and Christy Cluck, our, oh, hello Lisa. This is Lisa Navrakol. She's with our Chamber of Commerce. She's the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce. And I'm just doing some brief introductions. I'll back up real quickly just for your benefit. Lisa, this is Tom Beckley with Raptelis Financial Consultants. He's from Kansas City. He's the project manager. And Bill Millis, our water utilities director, and Christy Cluck, our trust accountant. And Rocky and Liz from Raptelis are here with Tom. And we're going to be very, very informal this evening. And we're going to cut Tom loose, but anytime you guys have any questions or anything at all, just get his attention and we'll have whatever, answer your questions or have whatever discussion you'd like. Okay,
So we have a prepared presentation, and this is basically the same presentation we used to talk to the trustees last night. Basically, we're going to briefly go over the introductions, which Dan just did. Then we're going to talk about just a quick overview of the rate setting process, what we were hired to do by the city for the water and wastewater utilities. And then finally, kind of the meat of the presentation that we wanted to do tonight was a pricing objectives exercise. And the purpose of this pricing objectives exercise is to help us understand what you as customers of the utilities feel are important in helping us design a rate structure to recover the revenues for the utility. So first, I want to talk just briefly about the rate setting process, and this is kind of what we're going to be doing in this project. So step one is identify financial and pricing objectives. That's what we're doing here in this meeting, as well as we did yesterday with the trustees, and we've also done with staff previously. And the pricing objectives, we'll talk a lot more about the pricing objectives in a few minutes, but these really help us guide what we want to do with the rate structure. We'll talk how that works into step 4. Step 2, the next step, is to identify the revenue requirements and demand projections for the water and wastewater utilities. So we're going to identify what costs need to be recovered through the rates. So this is operating and maintenance costs for operating and maintaining the water and wastewater utility, as well as the capital costs, so the cost for debt service, as well as cash funded and rate funded capital, and other expenses that the utility incurs. So in total, this is how much cash the utilities need to generate each year. And we'll look at water individually and wastewater individually. Because ultimately, although the utilities authority here operates as a combined utility, we look at each utility independently so we can assure that each utility is recovering their appropriate share of cost from their customers, so that the water utility is recovering enough to pay for the water utility, wastewater is recovering enough to pay for the wastewater utility, and that you're not subsidizing one from the other. And then we'll kind of look at them combined as well. And in some limited instances, although we're not looking at electric as part of this study, we will look at kind of some total metrics, especially when it comes to debt service coverage, which has to be covered by the entire authority as a whole. The next step, step 3, is to allocate costs. And what we do in the cost allocation step is we take those total revenue requirements we identified, the total dollars each the water and wastewater utility need to generate them, and we break them down into building blocks of costs. We look at how much it costs to deliver 1,000 gallons of water to each customer, how much it costs to treat 1,000 gallons of water from each customer, both on the water side and wastewater side. And these building blocks are important because basically we determine the cost for any customer to provide the same service, deliver water, treat water. And although ultimately we will look at rates by customer class, for example, we'll look at how much if we had rates by customer class, because right now we only have a single block rate structure. I'll show you the rate structure in a minute. But we'll look at rates by customer class, but even though the rates are different, the building blocks are the same. So for the same level of service, each customer pays the same, and differences in rates come about because of different demands they place on the system. The next step is to design the rate structures. So this is where we take those building blocks, and then when we consider the pricing objectives that we're talking about, what rate structures can we design to meet those pricing objectives? So do we want to promote conservation? Do we want to better promote cost of service? Do we want to have rates that better address affordability through some means or other? So basically, we'll work with those building blocks, consider the pricing objectives that we're identifying now with members of the public here, as well as trustees previously, as well as staff, and try and develop some rate structures that address those pricing objectives. And finally, we'll assess the effectiveness of each proposed rate structure in addressing pricing objectives. Now, as we'll talk about here shortly with the pricing objectives, the challenge with these objectives, we're going to look at 11 pricing objectives that we're going to rank tonight. Ideally, you'd like to address all 11 of these pricing objectives with the single rate structure, but they're competing. If you have a rate structure that emphasizes one, by design, it's going to hurt another pricing objective. So we'll talk about some of those trade-offs and how they impact rates in more detail here in a few minutes. I just want to briefly kind of go over the rate structure so we all have an understanding of how the utilities rates work right now. These are inside city rates. Outside city rates are higher than these, and we have about 1,000 outside city customers. Majority of the utilities customers are inside city customers. So for the water rates, which are on the top, we have a charge that increases by meter size. So it starts at $6.60 for a 3/4 inch meter, which is what a typical residential customer would have, and then increases up to $236.91 for a 6-inch meter. And then for your water usage, all customers pay $6.60 for each 1,000 gallons of water that they use. On the sewer side, similarly, we have an $8.13 base charge. Now, this does not vary by meter size. Of course, you don't have a sewage meter. However, some utilities will vary it based on your water meter size because it should be a reflection of how much sewer demand you could potentially place on the system, but that's not universal. So it's not uncommon to see what we have here, which is a single base charge for all customers, and then we pay $3.30 per 1,000 gallons of sewer treated. So when we're talking about rate structure design, what do we want to do? Obviously, we talk about revenue requirements. That's the step 2 of our process. We're going to identify the revenue requirements. We want to build a rate structure that will cover our revenue requirements, generate enough revenue to meet the revenue requirements identified for the utility. We want to be responsive to the objectives of the utility stakeholders, which are customers as well as not just the trustees, but ultimately the trustees work for the customers, and their goal, I believe, if you talk to them, is to meet the needs of the customers. So what do we mean here? We mean hopefully we can come to a rate structure that meets the pricing objectives that we're going to talk about here tonight. And finally, we want to be consistent with industry practices. In general, why we want to be consistent with industry practices? Because then it's defensible. Because of course, we have to do this in a manner that is defensible under law. We don't want to be out there on the limb. And most importantly, what it comes down to is we want to be fair to all customers so that all customers are being treated fairly and equitably. There are 2 foundational pricing objectives. So these are 2 pricing objectives that we're not going to rank today because these are what basically givens. One of them is financial sufficiency. So as I mentioned, step 2 of the process is to identify each utility's revenue requirements. We're going to develop rates that will recover those revenue requirements. So whatever the revenue requirements are for water utility, wastewater utility, we're going to recover rates that will generate those. If there were some sort of subsidy from the general fund or something, maybe we wouldn't have that goal, but in general, what we're talking about here is generating enough revenue. The other one is, I just touched on this, is defensibility. We don't want to have something that we can't defend. It's not fair and equitable to customers. So these are givens. So you won't see these when we go to the exercise. These won't be one among the 11 pricing objectives that we will ask you to rank. So this is kind of a slide outlining financial sufficiency, which I just talked about. Sometimes I get ahead of myself. We want to minimize potential for litigation when it comes to defensibility. And of course, one other thing I should mention is that we need to be consistent with bond covenants. Especially in the coming years, the water utility for the Water 2040 project, we will be issuing debt, and there are certain covenants related to issuing that debt that we will be required to meet. So our financial plan will ensure that those are met. Next, I want to talk about weighing pricing objectives. So, as I mentioned, we have 11 pricing objectives we're going to look at tonight, and we're going to rank these pricing objectives. And I'll talk about each one of these individually here in a minute, but we're showing them here on a scale, and there's no particular order to which they're on the scale. Actually, they're in alphabetical order. But what's important here to recognize, as I mentioned before, is some of these are competing objectives. So if we think one is more important, we have to recognize that we're going to have to sacrifice something else to design a rate structure that best addresses that specific pricing objective. And I'll give you some examples, some of the most important examples of some of these competing objectives here at the end of the presentation. So the first one, and these are in alphabetical order, they're not meant to be in any order of importance. Affordability. Should we be doing something through our pricing structure to address affordability? Right now we have a base charge that's just under $15. So regardless of how much water a customer uses in a month, they pay $15 for water and wastewater service. That's pretty typical, but if we want to be affordable and address customers on a fixed income, disadvantaged customers, that's something that we may want to consider is, what the proper level of base charge is, and it really limits how much we may want to increase that base charge. We don't like to say that, well, if you don't have money, then you shouldn't be using a lot of water, so you need to keep your usage down, but certainly, however much you have in your base charge, customers have no control over. So at least with whatever we have in volume charge, we can, tell people, well, you can control your water bill by being, careful how much water you use. But we understand certainly if somebody has a family of 8, they're going to use a fair bit of water no matter what. The next one is conservation demand management. So for a lot of utilities around the country, conservation is important. There's a couple reasons for that. In many cities, water is a precious resource and it's difficult to come by. Based on our understanding of the city of Stillwater's situation, that's less of a challenge here in Stillwater currently. We have sufficient water resources for now and well into the future, the city believes. However, there's still some belief that water is a precious resource and there should be some conservation. Do we want to do that through our rates? Is there something we want to do through our rates to encourage our customers to conserve, even though we have plenty of water? Is it the right thing to do environmentally? Next is cost of service-based allocations. So when we look at the rate structure, do we want to move to a rate structure that better reflects costs different customers place on our system? Do we want to have different rates for commercial versus residential customers versus industrial customers, which we don't currently have? Like I said, right now all customer classes pay the same base charge and the same volume rate. There's no differentiation between customer classes. Conservation rates is actually another approach to cost service-based rates. If we move to conservation rates, that better reflects cost of service in some ways. So this is something that we may want to consider. Next is ease of implementation. Do we have, I'm sorry, yes?
Are most businesses on what level of meter within that first?
The meters, I would say they can range anywhere from that 5/8 inch to 6 inch. I mean, because if you have a relatively small business, especially a small office, they'll be on a 5/8 inch meter.
Which is the same as a resident?
Yes.
Okay.
3/4 inch meter, I'm sorry.
Okay.
3/4, it varies by city sometimes. But yeah, 3/4 is the smallest that the city of Stillwater has. But certainly a small office building can easily run, or even any store that just has a bathroom, which are quite a few businesses, they wouldn't need anything more than a 3/4 inch meter. And then obviously our large businesses can range up to a 6 inch meter if they have a process that involves a lot of use of a lot of water. So, yes, sir.
Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure. This one, yes.
There was one slide where you said something about shifting demands to certain periods.
That would be conservation demand management. So especially if you had a system that was being stressed by its capacity, you may wish to shift demand to certain periods of time. For instance, I was discussing with Dan earlier today, we have an AMI system here in the city of Stillwater where we get hourly meter reads. And theoretically, we could try to shift demand away from usually between 6 a.m. and 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. and 7 p.m. are our highest water demand periods for many utilities, because that's when people are showering, getting ready to go to work, and then getting home from work and doing cooking, cleaning, and things like that. So if we had a challenge, maybe some utilities may wish to shift demand away from those periods of time to other periods of time, so you could have rates that reflect the time during the day they're using. I'm not saying many utilities have done that, but certainly with AMI, that is something that can be done, and that's something the city of Stillwater would have the ability to do if they desired.
Well, I guess what I'm not understanding is the terminology. What do you mean shifting demand?
Just encouraging customers not to use water during a certain time of day, a certain
How do
day,
you do that?
by raising rates
Okay.
For that specific period.
for that specific period.
Well, isn't that a little bit kind of self-serving, isn't it? You're saying that you actually force people to not use water during a certain period of the day by raising the rates
We
at
would,
that particular time of the day.
we wouldn't force them to do anything, we would just encourage them not to by raising the rate.
Okay, I'm not going to play tomato, but if it is what it is, and that actually forces people, for an example, if I, as a low-income resident, want to save money, then I have to wash a couple of loads of clothes at 2 a.m., which is not what I would like to do.
Let me weigh in there a little bit.
Okay?
In the very unlikely event that we would adopt, of course, I don't have a vote, but I can go out on a limb here and say it's going to be very, very unlikely that we would have a rate structure that's going to do this. And the only reason that we might consider it is if we had a shortage of water and we needed to conserve, or as Tom had kind of, I guess, used as an example, if there was a certain part of town that didn't, or maybe the whole town, maybe the whole system just couldn't meet the demand, and we would have to, you know, in order to lower the demand, we may then, you know, consider a rate structure that would make it more expensive to use water during the high demand period, to try and flatten that out because of system limitations. We're not experiencing those, and like I say, I'll go out on a limb here and say, I think it's very, very unlikely that you're going to see this in any type of proposed rate structure. This is a pricing objective, but as far as the time of use on water rates for a day, we're talking kind of way out there. And so
So
don't get
what
too
you're saying-
fixated on, I guess.
So what you're saying is then at no time were we in the city of Stillwater, residential customers, because I'm not a business,
Right.
and say residential customers. So at no time then was there a rate structure designed to force residential customers to use more water late night as opposed to peak time and off-peak time. We never had anything like that.
I can't say never, but as long as I've been here, no, we have not, and there's never been any consideration for that.
Okay, well, it seems kind of self-serving, but I'm not going to win this argument,
Yeah.
but I'll just let you know it ain't cool. So go ahead
Well,
on,
very
go
good.
along.
And I think one of the most important things to consider when we talk about cost of service rates, and if we consider having different rates for residential and commercial, which a lot of utilities do, part of that is based on the peaking demands placed on the system, because what you have to recognize is we've built a water system. What's our treatment capacity?
Our water treatment capacity, on average is 18 to 20 million.
Okay, but let's just call it 20 million gallons. So we can deliver 20 million gallons of water per day. And we built a treatment plant, and that plant is there 365 days a year. Now, if we have a business that uses 1 million gallons a day 365 days a year, they're using that capacity every day and paying for it every day. However, the challenges we have is we have some customers who may use 1 million gallons a day, but they only use it 10 times a year. But we've built that same 1 million gallons of capacity in a plant that's there 365 days a year, that they're only using 10 days a year. And so that's where a lot of these differences in costs come about when we talk about how do you determine why a residential is different than commercial. It really comes down to these peaking factors and the fact that we've built a utility that is always available to meet their demand, but they're not using it every day. So that's an important factor. And then when it comes to, maybe we want to shift stuff around, it's because we always have that demand. And if there's something we can do to encourage people, sometimes we may want to have a rate structure that does that. I don't want to presuppose an answer for this study, but like Dan said, I don't believe we're going to come to an answer in this rate study that's going to have a time of day, even though we have the technology.
It's just that, at the risk of sounding argumentative, it's just that you take for an example, if executives go to work in a particular business district, and a lot of them decide to fill up for the day when they first come into town. And if the filling station owner realizes that I've got this group of guys and girls that come in between these hours, they seem to fill up every day during this time. So why don't I just raise the rate to make this money right quick, and hopefully they won't say anything. I mean, that's kind of the way I feel. You're saying that, if you use water during these daytime hours, we're going to have to raise the rates there, and it looks like to me it's a hustle.
Well, and I want to be clear. Again, what Dan mentioned, I don't think we're going to do anything based on time of day pricing or day of week pricing. I'm pretty confident based on our discussions with the city so far that that's not going to happen. But even setting that aside, even if we go to rates by customer class, which is much more likely for different rates for residential, commercial, that's a much more likely outcome. How do we get to those different rates? What you have to recognize is that step 2, when I said we're going to determine how much money the utility needs to generate, no matter what rate structure we look at, they're all going to generate that same amount of revenue. And the idea is just how do we recover it, equitably from each customer class. So it's the same pie, and it's just how do we cut it up. So like in your example, it's not that we're trying to make more profit, because we don't make profit as a municipal utility. We're just.
You just have to show zero at the end of the year.
Well, in terms of what we're doing,
yeah.
All we're doing is we're figuring out how big of a pie the utility needs to generate, and then how do we slice up that pie. And each rate structure will be a different way to slice up that pie. So even if we come to residential commercial, for example, it's not that we're going to be making more money off of one class. Well, we will be making, but the pie, the size of the pie will stay the same.
And let me clarify something Tom just said, is that what their scope of service is to calculate the revenue requirements based on the cost of service, not to look at the transfer to the general fund. That's a policy issue that's beyond. They're going to calculate what the actual cost of providing the water service is.
Yeah. And I imagine the other two points there where you may target specific customer classes and target discretionary use, you apply the same
it's the same thing. So it would be
concept as you did in the earlier.
Right, and it's the same pie issue. Basically, it's what we call revenue neutral. It's like no matter what rate structure we have, it's not that one rate structure is going to generate more revenue for the utility. It's just a different way of slicing up the pie to recover costs differently based on cost of service principles. An example of targeting discretionary uses in the city of Wichita, each customer, like I said, here in the city of Stillwater, each customer pays $6.60 per thousand.
Wichita Falls, Texas.
No, the city of Wichita, Kansas.
Wichita, Kansas, okay.
But so here in Stillwater, each customer pays $6.60 per 1,000 gallons of water, whether you use 1,000 gallons a month or 1 million gallons a month. In the city of Wichita, they actually look at each customer's average winter consumption. So say you use 3,000 gallons per month in the winter. For your water, whatever you use from 0 to 110% of your average winter consumption, you pay one rate. For anything from 111% to 310% of your average winter consumption, you pay a higher rate. And then anything over 310% of your average winter consumption, you pay an even higher rate that is very high. It's more than double the first block.
And that's for residential too?
For residential and commercial in the city of Wichita. And so they are targeting, they're saying anything over 310% of your average winter consumption is discretionary, is very discretionary use, and they really want to encourage you not to use that water. They're not saying you can't use that water.
So if you use it...
If you use it, you're going to pay a very high rate for that water. And a lot of cities in California and Arizona are doing exactly the same thing. They have different approaches to determining what those blocks are, but this is becoming more common in areas with very scarce water resources, which we don't have. But I want to provide you an example of what we mean here. And part of what we're doing here is, like we said, based on our discussions with the city, we don't believe conservation is very important to the city of Stillwater. But we don't want to presuppose an answer. We want to talk about these issues. We don't want to just ignore conservation, because if I ignored it, somebody would come in here and say, why aren't you talking about conservation? If conservation is important, then we need to consider it. And we don't want to presuppose that conservation is not important.
Okay. Well, I thank you for the effort.
Thank you. I appreciate your participation. I really do. These presentations are boring if I just sit here and talk all by myself.
Okay.
We talked about cost service-based allocations, ease of implementation, and this isn't, this is basically, especially when we consider some of the more exotic rate structures, like I said, like what Wichita does, there is some challenges to implementing that sometimes. Do we have the data to be able to do that? Here in Stillwater, we have a pretty sophisticated meter reading system. We're not using it for that now, but it would be challenging if we moved to one of these more sophisticated. So is that something we want to consider? Quite frankly, as customers, usually you guys don't care about ease of implementation. It's like you want to address other pricing issues. But we include it as something isn't important, because we'll talk about another one that is closely tied to ease of implementation.
Well, now, hold on, just one thing.
Sure.
Where you're talking right there with pricing objectives. Let me take you to a piece of data that may be under one of those umbrellas, but it's not mentioned specifically. And that is that in Wichita Falls, Texas, which is south of here, they were talking about earlier in the year of recycling sewage water.
They're doing it.
A lot of cities.
So they
doing
finally
it.
decided to do that.
They're doing
Now,
it.
I don't know, but that is repulsive to me. But maybe they've got a way to handle it. Now, my question is, how does something like that, going outside of the normal thing, figure into pricing objectives?
Well,
If that's even relevant.
that's more driven by need, scarcity of water, just a desire to conserve water, or in some cases, there's limited cases where utility is willing to provide an industrial customer in particular recycled water at a lower cost than potable water. But that's more just, there are many cities that recycle water now. San Antonio recycles much of its water. And some of it is
Sewage water.
sewage water. But what you have to recognize is once that water is treated, and Dan said this on the radio this morning, the water that's coming out of our sewage treatment plant is cleaner than the water that's in, that we take in. We treat it to, and this is the case in most cities, especially, I live in Missouri on the Missouri River, and I can tell you, the water they pull out of the Missouri River is filthy. The treated wastewater they put back in the Missouri River is much cleaner than the water that's in the river. But there's many requirements to reuse water. In most cases, you can only put it on lawns, and even when you put it on a lawn, on grass, you have to have signs up saying, hey, this is reused water, you shouldn't have your kids playing on it, but even that's pretty minor. It's fine to golf on, you just don't want to be rolling around in it for hours on it. Well, and you don't want to drink it. However, I will say, and because direct right.
Yeah, it depends on the level of treatment.
Right.
Yeah.
In some cities in Texas, and Wichita Falls is one of them, they have so little water available to them that in order to meet their needs, they have had to go to direct potable reuse. And so we're not Lonnie, let's put it this way, we're worlds away from that
I'm sure
at this point in time. Right.
Now, there is one other thing here. I don't know if it figures in with the pricing thing, but in this part of the country, in Payne County, because that's where we live, I have encountered some people who have reservoirs, but they sell their reservoir water for the oil well fracking folks. Does that figure in anywhere in any of this mix, or is that just outside of the scope of things?
Yeah, that's, I mean, what you're talking about is people who have water, own the rights to water and they're selling it. This is the cost of, the cost to provide water and wastewater service to our customers.
Yeah, from our source.
Right, right.
Okay, well, disregard that.
Next is economic development, and I like to caveat economic development. So what we're talking about here today, obviously for the city of Stillwater, for any city, economic development is important. What we're specifically talking about here tonight is, do we want to encourage economic development through our water and wastewater rates? And really, when it comes down to it, is there something we want to do to lessen the load, to encourage economic development, which again, since we're talking about fixed size of the pie, would mean somebody else has to pay that. So I want to be very clear that we're not saying that the city of Stillwater doesn't believe economic development is important. All we're asking is, should the rates be encouraging economic development, or water and wastewater rates? Next is equitable contributions from new customers. So this is, what we're talking about here is many cities have a system impact fee, a development fee, and we have a capacity fee. It's relatively modest compared to some cities in some regions. But is there do we want to collect more to reflect the cost of the infrastructure that new customers are connecting to? And so this basically promotes intergenerational equity. We're saying we build some assets that new customers are connecting to. Do we need to recover more from them? Now, of course, you'd say yes. The one flip side to that is sometimes it can hurt new development if you would implement these fees, and that's really kind of the negative on these fees. Next is minimization of customer impacts. And what we're talking about here is when we start talking about these cost of service principles, rates by customer class, we want to encourage conservation, is anytime we do anything, so as I cautioned last night, I'm just going to use a number. We were early in the study, so this is not anything to do with the increase that we will see, the rate change that we will see here. But say we needed 4% more revenue here in the city of Stillwater. If we implement anything to reflect customer classes or conservation demand, what happens if you do a 4% rate increase, some customers will see a 0% rate change, while other customers may see a 10% rate increase. So how big of a disparity between these customers are we willing to accept? Because the alternative is, if we need 4% more revenue, we just take that rate structure I showed you earlier and just increase everything by 4%, we will generate 4% more revenue. However, anything we do to address these pricing objectives means that there's going to be different impacts on some different customers. So some customers will see a 0% or 2% increase, others may see an 8, 10% increase. So how important is this to kind of minimize customer impacts, and what level of customer impacts is the city of Stillwater comfortable with between customer classes? Next is rate stability. So we're going to look at a 10-year rate plan, actually, is what the city's asked us to look at. And so there may be 1 year we may need a 5% rate adjustment, the next year we may need 0, and the year after we may need 4, and then a 0, and then a 3 and a 0. So instead of doing that, we'd rather have a 3, 3, 3, 3 that better reflects, recognizing that we may increase rates a little bit more earlier, but it provides a more stable and smooth program of rate adjustments over time than just having a larger rate adjustment 1 year and a 0 or a much smaller rate adjustment another year, and just what we're comfortable with as a city. Next is revenue stability. So one of the challenges a water and wastewater utility face is that our revenues are dependent on usage of our commodity, and that can be impacted by conditions outside of our control. The biggest single one is is climatic conditions. And in general, if we have a hot, dry summer, our water consumption will increase and will generate more revenue, and we'll probably have a pretty good year, and we'll be able to spend some of that money on capital projects or something else, or need less of a rate increase in the future. Challenge is, if we have a cool, wet summer, if it's a little cooler, if it's a little wetter, our revenues are going to be down. So say our usage will be down, our revenues will be down. So if our usage goes down 10% as a water utility, our costs do not go down 10%. We can't lay off 10% of our staff. We can't cut 10% of our treatment plant away. We can't cut 10% of our transmission system away. We can't get rid of 10% of our vehicles. Most of our costs are fixed. The only thing that is really variable is electricity and chemicals, which is a pretty small, piece of our costs. So if our consumption is down 10%, our revenue is down 10% if it's all based on usage. Now here, as I showed you, we have a fixed charge. So that amount of revenue from the fixed charge is stable regardless of how much our customers use, and that provides revenue stability for the utility regardless of usage. But we still generate a lot of revenue from that $6.60 volume charge on the water side. So the question here is, do we want to have more revenue stability for the utility? And it provides less risk to the utility. If they're going to come up short on revenue if we have a very cool, wet summer.
So do you raise the rate?
Well, I think the challenge here is, again, because the piece of pie is the same, really what you do to encourage revenue stability is you have a larger fixed charge that impacts it. The challenge, and I'll talk about some of the compromises, is the problem with the larger fixed charge that I mentioned is that it hurts affordability. Simple to understand and update. And right now we have a pretty simple rate structure. You pay a fixed charge, every customer pays $6.60 per 1,000 gallons of water. If we move to rates by customer classes, I don't think that's very complex, but certainly it's more complex than what we have now. If we want to encourage conservation, which I don't think is, but that's where we really start to run into more complex rate structures. And this is, are we comfortable increasing the complexity of our rate structure and therefore increasing the complexity to, kind of update that rate structure and go out and educate our customers about that rate structure. In general, we don't want to, kind of have this as a limiting factor. If we think something's important, if we think conservation is important, if we think economic development is important, we need to do something in the rate structure, that generally overrides this. But we like to talk about this as a pricing objective, just how important is it to the community? Do we like our, relatively simple rate structure, recognizing that we don't recognize cost by customer classes and we don't encourage conservation, for example. The next is sustainability, and this is one actually that we added at the presentation last night at the behest of the trustees, and something that they expressed some concern about. And really, what we're talking about here is the city of Stillwater is not alone in this, and there a lot of our clients have been dealing with this. And it's, we built water transmission system and this wastewater collection system, over the past 100 years, and they wear out. They're only intended to last 60 to 100 years, and a lot of those assets that we've put in the ground are starting to wear out. They still function, but they're functioning in a less and less, reliable and safe manner, but they're still there. And so we have challenges. We have more water main breaks. In cases of sewer, we'll have more infiltration, inflow, more water leaking into our sewers, which we haven't treated the sewer plant. And it creates challenges. It doesn't, we're still getting water service when our toilets flush, it still goes away, but it's creating challenges. And at some point in the future, we're going to have to replace it. So it doesn't have to be replaced today, but it would probably be a good business practice to start replacing some of that infrastructure today. Start replacing 1% or 2% of our water transmission system and wastewater collection system every year, not just because it's failed, but just because we know we're going to have to replace it at some point, and we might as well start now to on a path to sustainability to over time replacing a certain portion of our system every year. And this is a challenge a lot of utilities have faced. And obviously what this means is that we'll have to be spending a little more on capital to do that every year that we're not doing right now in addressing those needs. Did you want to say something there?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Okay, look, on that part right there about the sustainability and replacing, bad pipes or whatever the case may be. Now, in my neighborhood, up on the northern end of my neighborhood on North Park Drive, you can look it up when you get a chance, up to where North Park Drive finally goes back to Perkins Road. There's a couple of homes there that the water department, the city, let me just say the city repair folks, have been there at least 4 or 5 times this year. Now, I don't know if you're aware of that off the top of your head, but, and it seems like the minute that you think they've got it solved, then here they come right back. There's also right around the corner from my house, there is a, right where North Park Drive turns into Liberty, right before you get to that juncture, there was water coming up out of the ground. Now, most of my neighbors said, oh yeah, it's an underground spring, and no, it's not an underground spring.
It's a broken pipe.
But I didn't want to argue with him because I was a new guy in the neighborhood, and the new guy in the neighborhood can't argue with him. But they said that it was an underground spring. Well, finally, it had to be replaced, okay? Now, they went and they fixed 20 foot or so of that area, put down a brand new piece of concrete, made it look all pretty, and then 2 days later, water's coming right back up out of the ground. Now, how does constant repairs like that play into the price of sustainability?
Well, and really what we're hoping to address with sustainability is to eliminate those issues, because like I said, ideally the goal would be to replace about 1 to 2% of the system each year. Not because it absolutely has to be replaced, but because we know that we'll have to replace it at some point in the next 50 years. And so we might as well start now instead of waiting until it becomes a huge bill. Right.
Until we
And
have
so-
to go in there 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 times.
Right. And so
In a
this,
year.
right.
Yeah.
And so and what typically happens, I don't want to presuppose too much about a program, but usually the city will work on basically assessing its entire system, identifying which areas are most in need of replacement, and that area may be one of the areas most in need of replacement, so it would be pretty high on the list. That would be among the 1 to 2% replaced first, potentially, if it's among the worst in the city. Who knows, there may be other neighborhoods that are even worse.
It may be, but just may be. I just,
I mean, I'm sure you hope not, but.
I hope not, but I haven't gone to look at it or check it, but
Exactly.
it's a problem.
But certainly that's the challenge, and it really comes down to, we want to address these issues now, recognizing that maybe we pay a little more in our rates now to avoid paying a lot more in our rates later.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Which rates are you talking about increasing? The Beck report increases, which are supposedly restricted funds, or the 2.5 that they was charging, which was the national, which was just about the national average at the time?
We're looking at at all the rates the water and wastewater utility charge. We're looking at how much revenue each water and wastewater utility is
And
generating.
are they going to go up from what we're paying now?
I don't want to presuppose an answer, but especially with Water 2040, we're pretty confident water rates are going to go up, wastewater rates. Part of the challenge we're facing as a utility, and we've seen this with every single one of our clients basically across the country, is water consumption is down. Regardless of economic development, because what's happened is there's an ethos of conservation among a lot of people, even in areas where conservation doesn't need to be important. And every single time somebody puts in a new toilet, a new shower head, a new dishwasher, a new clothes washer, any new faucet, that fixture uses less water than the one it's replacing. And it generates less wastewater than the one it's replacing, because
I would agree with that. I've got one of those water conserving commodes too. Flush it twice.
Well, in fact, you have to flush it
I've
twice.
got something in common.
It's not saving me a minute.
Theoretically, but But regardless, when we look at water consumption per capita, it is decreasing among all our customers. And so if water consumption decreases 1%, our revenues go down 1%. So even if our cost didn't change a penny, if consumption goes down, we have to raise rates. Because we can't lay off 1% of our, again, kind of that same example, we can't lay off 1% of our staff, cut 1% of our infrastructure, and all that just because our consumption went down a little bit. We still need the exact same revenue requirement we need. Now, I certainly understand everybody faces inflation, but the utility faces the same inflation. Our costs are going up as well. And so if you look at the fact that our consumption is decreasing over time and just inflationary cost increases, utility rates, in most places across the country, the average increase per year for the past 10 years has been about 6%, right, Rocky? Because we do a national survey for the American Water Works Association where we look at utility rates across the country, and on average, they go up 6% per year for water and wastewater. But a lot of that is also on the wastewater side. In particular, there's regulatory requirements a lot of utilities are facing where they're having to do things, upgrade their system to meet regulatory requirements, and just other cost issues that the utility faces.
See, that's the other question, about regulatory stuff, the EPA. My question is, what specific regulations affect what we got going on?
The Clean Water Drinking Act,
Which, in what way?
that's what regulates the quality of the water that we provide.
So has it gotten austere, or is it somewhat the same as it always was?
Oh, no, they have dialed down on the regulations, significantly. There were, I think, maybe last year alone, there were 3 major rules that the DEQ accepted primacy on. And what that means is that when the DEQ accepts primacy, that means that they're the primary enforcer of the EPA rule. And so there were 3 major drinking water rules that they accepted primacy on last year alone. And all of those have implications on the level of treatment that we have to do and maintain the water to.
Now, has it increased the level of treatment or lessened the level?
Oh, no, it increases the level of
Which
treatment.
increases the cost to operate.
Right,
Which
absolutely.
increases the rate.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Thank you, EPA, for that.
Yeah, the piece.
It's a challenge because, the federal government, they set the rules for how clean our water needs to be, what we need to do.
And we can't do away with it because we need that.
Well, to some extent, somebody needs to set the rules. Do you want each city individually deciding how much, how clean drinking water should be and how, clean wastewater discharge should be? A lot of people call it unfunded federal mandates, because they set the rules, but they don't pay for meeting the rules. But on the other hand, somebody needs to set the rules because you don't want, here, here in Oklahoma, we don't want to have more stringent rules than Texas. Texas, those guys, they would do anything, right? But that's just an example. You agree with that? I'm like, oh. And so, somebody needs to set the rules, and so the federal government sets the rules, and then as Pam mentioned, then the state environmental quality, DEQ here, it's called DNR in Missouri, they have different names in each state, but basically there's a state regulatory agency that then enforces those federal rules, onto the utilities in their state. So it's a challenge. On the wastewater side, a lot of cities are facing even bigger problems than that. We do work in some big cities right now. St. Louis is spending $3 billion to address wastewater issues.
They got a lot of people in St. Louis.
They got a lot of people, but they're looking at raising their rates 12% per year, every year, for wastewater. They just go up 12% a year to address these federal mandates, because what happened is basically the federal government changed the rules on what you can do with your wastewater. 20 years ago, when they designed a wastewater system, they just assumed when it rained a lot, you would spill a little bit of your wastewater into the river. It's very dilute. It's not a big deal. The Mississippi River is pretty dirty anyway, quite frankly. But the federal government has decided that that's not allowed anymore. And now the city of St. Louis has to do something to decide that, quite frankly. I mean, have we dealt with that? I mean, do we have CSOs or SSOs?
Oh, yeah, we have sanitary sewer overflows, yeah. In fact, we were under a consent order with the DEQ about 3 years ago on sanitary sewer overflows.
And so we've addressed those.
Yes.
And that's part of what the rate increases in the past addressed. Because so those sanitary sewer overflows, when we designed the system 30, 50 years ago, they were allowed. That was accepted practice. And then the EPA and the DEQ came in and said, you can't do that anymore. And we had to spend a lot of money to fix that. And so that's what, and that's where federal rules come into place, is really those types of impacts.
So our advantage is that we're a smaller county.
Actually, there's the rules and regulations. We're fortunate that we're big enough and that we're sophisticated enough to be able to address some of these. There's a lot of talk in the water supply world that the smaller providers who are also responsible to meet the same standards don't have the sophistication, may not have the technology, and may not even have the financial resources to do that. And so there's a lot of talk and concern about the ability for smaller water systems to survive, or continue to survive in this environmental regulatory environment, that we live in.
Yeah.
So those are the 11 pricing objectives that we're going to look at. Now I want to talk a little bit about why we need to rank these. And like I kind of mentioned before, is the challenge we face is these pricing objectives, in some cases, they're mutually exclusive or they're just competing. We can't meet one, and if we meet one, we sacrifice another. And to give you some of the largest examples is, for instance, revenue stability. If we want stable revenue, it's really hard. Again, it's probably not going to be a deal here, but conservation demand management really gets hurt, because if you're promoting conservation demand management, that means you're going to try and discourage that upper level of water usage. And if you're successful, quite frankly, what happens is your revenue is going to go down because you're going to discourage that usage. Another one is revenue stability and versus minimizing customer impacts. Again, the way we address revenue stability is it would be most likely through an increased base charge, but that would have a larger impact on certain customers who don't use much water. Cost of service versus simple to understand and update. As I mentioned, anything we do to address cost of service, whether it be different rates by customer class or whether we go to block rates to address conservation, it becomes more complex to understand than our relatively simple rate structure right now. Finally, affordability, and we recognize affordability is important. We have people on fixed incomes, we have low income people. But it is a challenge because it goes counter to cost service, because we're saying, with cost service, we're saying, well, we should charge people based on their demand on the system. But if we're saying, well, affordability is important, we're kind of like, well, we want to give people a break regardless of what their true cost of service is. And then the other one is revenue stability, because like I said, if you have a large fixed charge, which is how you typically address revenue stability, then that is really counter to affordability.
So, I don't want to keep interrupting, but I got a question.
I don't mind at all.
On this affordability thing now, you mentioned that, we charge people on how much they use, and that seems fair. But you can only help so much. For an example, City of Seattle, Washington has in their low to moderate income folks, they have this big buildup about, they say, people 50% of the bill, and man, buddy, we're Superman for you. And then they come back and give you the real deal. Whereas, for an example, if you are on Section 8 housing, where you get subsidized housing, and you won't qualify in certain areas. Now, I understand, but if they lived on what most folks in the low to moderate income range live, then they would they may reconsider about the Section 8 housing being a disqualifier. But it just seems a little austere when you are on the receiving end. So that's going to be a big problem for city governments, especially for utilities. And they can, like I say, they can only help so much.
Yeah, and it's a challenge addressing affordability, because there's two primary approaches, I'd say. One is through the rate structure. How can we do it through the rate structure? Some utilities have what they call lifeline rates, which is if you use just a little bit of water, we're not going to charge you a lot for that. So if you only use up to 2,000 gallons, we're saying if you're a little old lady on a fixed income and you stay under 2,000 gallons, you're going to charge, you're going to be charged a pretty low rate. This is how the city of Houston's rates actually work, for example. So if you only use up to 2,000 gallons, your water bill may only be like $6. But that really doesn't reflect the cost of providing service to them, how much it costs us to build the infrastructure and everything, and it really doesn't promote revenue stability, because then most of our revenue is coming through the volume charge. And so if we have a real cool, wet summer, we're going to, the utility is not going to have enough money, and how are we going to address that?
Is that class, like the lady that gets her bill, it's like $6 because she only uses the 2,000?
That's right. It's not based on a qualification, you're saying. And the challenge with this is that you have to accept that there's some tie between low income and using a little bit of water, which can be a challenge, especially with large families.
Right, but doesn't that add more of a cost to the other customers who got to use more than 2 gallons?
Absolutely. And what you see in the city of Houston is, for those lower, you pay less for those first few blocks, but the more you use, it goes up really quickly from that first couple thousand gallons. The incremental cost for the next 1,000 after that, and after that, and after that, it starts to increase very quickly. And so, again, because it's a fixed piece of pie, if you're giving the little old lady a break, somebody else is picking up that piece of pie. The other thing you can do is programs like you talk about, where you say, we'll credit you 50% of the bill. I can tell you, St. Louis MSD is a client of ours, and they have a low-income program where you can qualify. There's certain ways you qualify to get a 50% credit on your bill if you meet the requirements. They have been trying to get people in that program, and it is a real challenge for them to get people. They just don't want to do it. Or, I mean, quite frankly, even though they face significant increases on their wastewater bills, 12% a year for the past several years, it's still a pretty small bill relative to a lot of the other challenges they're facing economically, and it's just not worth it for them yet to go through to do the paperwork. In some cases is what we believe. It's still $40 a month. It's like, well, they don't want to have to go fill out the paperwork to get a $20 credit on it. And so it can be a challenge, and it becomes a challenge too in how you qualify people for those programs. Probably the simplest way is you just have to come in and prove you qualify for some other program. So, and usually, if you pay, the thing with Section 8 housing a lot of times is people in Section 8 housing don't pay their water bills anyway, because it's paid for by the landlord, it's included. But if it is, you could say, if you qualify for Section 8 housing, just bring in some documentation that you qualify.
You need to tell my landlord that.
I'm just providing an example. Right?
Right.
And I'm not saying all, but
needed to get a different landlord.
but if you qualify for another program, EBT or one of those other programs, basically you say, if you qualify for one of these programs, we'll assume you're qualified for our low-income program, because you don't want to go through your own qualification, because that becomes an administrative burden. Okay. So those are the 11 that we've kind of identified, the 10 that we had, and then, like I said, actually the trustees, felt that sustainability was important. We added that as a pricing objective last night, and we've included it on our survey here today. So are there any other pricing objectives that you guys feel should be included, that we should be looking at when we look at how we may structure our rates that are covered by one of these?
I've got a question about that. A few years ago, we had a rate of about $2.46 or something like that for 1,000 gallons.
Right.
And they hired this Beck company to write this report to tell the this city manager what he wanted to hear. And it ended up that the rates were going to increase rather exponentially, up to $6.50. But we were sold on the idea that there's extra charges, because a lot of this was based on the scare tactic that the CAW pipeline is in fact reaching its 35-year end of its designed lifetime, and might have to be replaced. Okay, so we all bought onto the thing, and all this money is supposed to be going in, all this extra money is supposed to be going into restricted funds. But you know as well as I do what lawyers do, and they have these loopholes in there that allow these restricted funds to be used for operations and maintenance, which is all there is in general funds. And so they're using them for general funds for anything they want to use it for. Now, I don't know how many millions they poured into these restricted funds, but they have nothing to do, I think, with the $20 million that they're going to give to, the SUA is going to give, the SUA trust is going to give to the city this year out of the trust funds. But I'm wondering how you're going to break that down, or what's going to happen to this Beck report money, this restricted fund account.
I can answer that. Every penny that has been collected, and Christy Cluck is the accountant who accounts for those for that money. She can attest to this, that every penny that was been collected, the increment over the $2.40 has been deposited in the water capital account, or likewise on the wastewater capital account. Every penny has been accounted for, and all of the expenditures, have been for capital expenditures. Part of it has been for some of the improvements. We're right now have a contract, over $6 million contract to make improvements to the pump station at CAW, because when we did the assessment of the CAW pipeline, we learned fortunately that it's not in as bad a condition as we had thought it might be. And so we've spent money there, we've spent money on a variety of, but everything is a capital projects. We've spent, how much money we've got committed with the engineering on Water 2040 with CH2 of Hill?
Well, first thing I thought, we got $3 million worth of construction going on right now at the wastewater plant. In active project.
Is that just for that new light?
New light?
Is that just for the new UV light system?
No, we
No, sir.
rebuilt the UV
Yeah.
system in-house.
Oh, we did.
Yeah, we did some rehab there. It's for the bar screens and for the pumps that pump all the sewages that comes into.
Oh, you got variable speed pumps at that station now?
Yes, sir. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah, 4 variables, frequency drives.
Okay, well, I know they got to do sledge truck and so on, yeah, okay.
Yeah, with the air money,
Yeah.
4 or 5 years ago.
Okay, but are they using any of this restricted fund money for updating the rural system out there?
Yes, it's the money that
We're paying
for the design work and the evaluation for the capital improvements associated with Water 2040 is being funded out of the water capital,
So
yes.
that total contract is $9 million, including, real estate, design, program
Right.
management, everything.
Right. And but we don't have enough cash to fund the entire construction of the project, so we'll have to go to the OWRB to get a loan from them, and then the debt service will be covered from those accounts.
For what? For the rural one?
For Water 2040, for the Southwest Water and Central Zone improvements.
Oh, okay. You'll do that on loans, okay.
Right. But the debt service will then be repaid from the water capital.
will they be paying a higher rate than the people in Stillwater?
No,
Or are we going to be paying for their upgrades?
The decision was made to not charge any type of a surcharge or anything to those particular users. The decision was made that the cost would just be blended into the overall rate structure.
I figured that's what it was.
Okay, we want to go through the pricing objectives exercise now. So we have here, this is a 3-page handout. There's a brief set of instructions on the front of the first page, but I'll go ahead and explain those. The second page is a kind of a summary of the 11 pricing objectives and definitions just of the 11 pricing objectives we talked about here today. And then the third page is a sheet where I'm going to ask you to check the boxes actually rating each of these objectives. So you'll see on this third sheet, there's 4 columns. There's essential, very important, important, and least important. So what we're going to ask you to do is for these 11 pricing objectives, we'd like you to select up to 3 that you feel are most essential in how we want to go about building rate structures for the city of Stillwater. And then you can select up to 3 that are very important. And then the other categories, important and least important, we want you to put the other pricing objectives in each of those categories. So we've gone through this process with the trustees as well as staff, and now we want to solicit your input, and the trustees were very interested in seeing what the input of the public would be and how they would rate these pricing objectives. Does anybody need a pen? No? Everybody got a writing utensil? Great. Just want to make sure. If you could hand with my associate Rocky, when you're done, I will actually tabulate them and then we can talk about the results.
Is that the end of your presentation?
We are going to tabulate the 3 results and discuss, mainly just do a debrief, essentially saying that as a result of this exercise, what seemed to rise to the surface.
Well, that's basically the end of our prepared
Yes.
remarks, and then we'll briefly discuss this and open it up to any final questions or comments.
Do you want to keep this? You can see that.
Okay, let's take a look here. So, based on your responses, we assign a numerical value to each one of your responses. 1 meaning is, you rate it as essential, and up to 4 is least important. And so, looking at kind of, what you as a group, felt was most important in a rate structure, you can see, these are ranked from most important, essential to least important. So affordability, rate stability, and sustainability were rated as important. And so when we talk about, rate stability, that was kind of the thing where we talked about, we don't want to see large impacts between customer classes. And so then the next most important was economic development, actually rated pretty high, among this group. And so, like I said, a lot of places they don't necessarily want to, it's not that economic development is not important, but do we want to do something through rates? And there's certainly things we can look at with the rates to encourage economic development that wouldn't necessarily, and especially if you look at, are there things we can do to promote new business that isn't already here and maybe could attract new business that wouldn't necessarily, hopefully, impact that pie that I've talked about too much? And that's something maybe we can work with city staff to identify more innovative ways to do that, and that's certainly something we want to consider. Minimization of customer impacts. Excuse me, I misspoke. Rates really. That's actually the one where we don't want large impacts between different customers. Then revenue stability actually rated pretty high among, well, 2 of you, and then 1 of you didn't have much care for it. But so, this is something we'll consider. And, this is already addressed pretty well through the rate structure, and so we probably wouldn't do, depending how dramatically we change the rate structure, there wouldn't be a significant impact to address revenue stability. And then, like I said, the next one, basically what comes after that are what's less important, equitable contributions from new customers. We already do some of this, but we wouldn't want to discourage new development. Cost service-based allocations is actually pretty low, so, we're saying we don't necessarily want to look at cost by customer classes potentially. We like what we have, which is relatively straightforward and doesn't address that. So we're, less concerned about that. Ease of implementation, we don't care how hard it is for staff and consultants to implement it. I'm not sure I blame you, that's what we pay staff and consultants for. Simple to understand and update. And finally, conservation demand management, I think, we talked about that. Certainly, I've heard that from the other groups we've talked to. When we talked to the trustees and we talked to staff, they certainly indicated that we're fortunate here in Stillwater that we have adequate water supply and we don't need to have a rate structure that encourages that. And you, members of the public here tonight, seem to feel the same way. So what we're going to do is we're working on this rate study process now. We're pretty early. We've been meeting all day with city staff collecting data. Right now on January 22nd, we have a meeting scheduled. Assuming all the data gets collected in a timely manner as provided by the city, we will be back here on January 22nd. We will be meeting with the trustees at 3:30 on that day, and then we will be having a public meeting just like this at 7 o'clock. And we will take a look at, what rate structures, we've determined, we're considering to address these pricing objectives. And we will talk about, why we looked at specific rate structures, which of these objectives they best help promote, and which objectives we sacrifice a little bit with different rate structures. So that will be your opportunity to see how this all plays out, and we will have this information, and we will use this information to frame our discussions for that evening and talking about why specific rate structures, which objectives they meet, whereas, what they don't. So that's basically the purpose of this, and you will see this again from us on January 22nd. So we're not just doing this and, forgetting about it. We will specifically talk about these issues on January 22nd. Are there any questions? Well, I certainly appreciate your time and attention in this presentation. And like I said, I appreciate your participation. It makes my job more interesting than just sitting up here talking for an hour straight. I do enjoy this job, and I enjoy helping communities like Stillwater, address these issues, and they are challenging. I wish I could come into cities and help you figure out how to cut rates, but that's just not the economic reality of the utility industry, unfortunately. We have increasing costs and we have increasing requirements. We have aging infrastructure that just needs to be addressed, and there's no way, it's not possible to do that while cutting rates. And so it's a difficult task. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Coming to see you. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.